Wes Anderson films carry a certain kind of charm. They feature carefully crafted cinematography that transports viewers into new and surreal worlds. But imagine finding real places you could visit with that same unmistakable aesthetic. Pastel facades, vintage quirkiness, and perfectly framed views.
This all started as a travel bucket list, and that was something that was for me and Amanda personally. And I was looking around on the internet for where we might go next, started finding these places that looked as though they could be plucked from the world of Wes Anderson.
And it's just captivating to see all the pastels and everything that he has throughout those films. And then when you start looking around, you're like, whoa, I can find these places pretty easily if you're looking correctly at a place.
Authors and travelers Wally and Amanda Koval began their journey with a simple Instagram page, AWA, or Accidentally Wes Anderson. Soon, they found themselves at the center of an increasingly expanding community, over 300,000 members in just 1 year.
The Instagram page started in 2017. This was very much a community effort from the very beginning, that we were capturing photos from elsewhere that we had not yet been and pulling them together, doing our own research on them and curating them, so to speak. People started sending us the photos that they felt were AWA.
The Accidentally Wes Anderson hashtag also blew up around the same time. So it was like you could just search that and find like a treasure trove of anywhere in the world that people were hashtagging it or DMing them to us, and then we finally started the submissions through our website.
Their online success led to a book deal, Accidentally Wes Anderson, and it became a New York Times bestseller, earning rave reviews. Their latest book, Accidentally Wes Anderson Adventures, continues to offer readers a visually captivating tour of hidden gems and inspiring destinations, blending stunning imagery with the Koval's knack for storytelling.
If you think of AWA as a dartboard, that bullseye would be a perfectly pink symmetrical hotel in the middle of Prague. And then once you start to kind of explore those outer rungs is when you get into more people. And maybe things that Wes Anderson himself wouldn't necessarily touch on, but things that we're exploring because the community has shown interest in that. It's fun, it's factually based, it's interesting, it's historical, it's architecture, it's interesting people that have done interesting things that you maybe just didn't know about.
Authors Wally and Amanda Koval with their brand new book, Accidentally Wes Anderson Adventures. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Pumped to be here.
This is a coffee table book, and it's your second coffee table book, and you have a certain treatment and a certain aesthetic related to Wes Anderson films. Why Wes Anderson? Where did that come from, and how did we end up with the second book, your second? I don't know if it's a bestseller with the New York Times yet, but you have at least one.
We're Book of the Year for 2024, so that's
is that it?
Yeah.
That's one of the. Yeah, that's all. That's it. That's
Thanks,
one
Barnes
of
and Noble.
Thanks, Barnes and Noble, for Book of the Year 2024. Why Wes Anderson? I mean, I guess a few different reasons. There's, this all started as a travel bucket list, and that was something that was for me and Amanda personally, and we were traveling a lot in 2017. And ultimately, I wanted to just find places that we could maybe go to one day. And as I was looking around on the internet for where we might go next, started finding these places that looked as though they could be plucked from the world of Wes Anderson. But they were real places. And what we would find is each of them would have an interesting story to be told about them. So I just started kind of compiling them. We were fans of Wes's work, but I think that the aesthetic kind of taps and can be found in interesting places without really trying too hard.
Every time he had a new movie coming out, we don't go to the movies a lot, but it always seemed like when a new Wes Anderson movie came out, we would go see it in theaters because that felt like that's where it should be seen. And it's just captivating to see all the pastels and everything that he has throughout those films. And then when you start looking around, you're like, whoa, I can find these places pretty easily if you're looking correctly at a place.
So how did you come up with putting the book together, the pictures? Were you going through all of your pictures and you decided to do what? You started an Instagram page?
Sure. So the Instagram page started in 2017, and I started finding these places on the internet, so to speak, pulling them off, giving credit to photographers, and pulling out and doing a little bit of research on where it was, what it was, and when it was built. So many of the photos, though, we look back in our camera rolls on our phones, and we see that we were taking photos similar to that at the time. We started compiling places that we had never been before. So this was very much a community effort from the very beginning, that we we were capturing photos from elsewhere that we had not yet been and pulling them together, doing our own research on them and kind of, I guess you could say, coordinating them or curating them, so to speak. The community started in 2017 when I started the Instagram account. Over the course of the first 3 or 4 months, grew slowly but surely, about 1,500 people or so.
That's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people, could fill a sizable high school gym. And then there was an article that was written about us from one of those 1,500 members of the community. This woman worked for Vogue magazine, reached out to us, did an interview, and overnight went from 1,500 people to about 26,000 people. And so you went from that high school gymnasium to a sizable stadium. And that's kind of where it started to skyrocket a little bit.
Now, are you photo editors? Or are you in the business at all? Because just taking a bunch of travelogue pictures or places you wanted to go and throwing them up on Instagram, that could be a full-time job if you want it.
On paper, Amanda and I have zero credentials that should be leading to something like this, or managing a community, or doing anything having to do with photo and video editing. I worked in B2B marketing, and she worked in
Catering.
Kosher corporate catering in the kitchens of New Jersey, right?
Okay.
We were living in Brooklyn in a small apartment, and we were just kind of pulling these things together for fun.
And figuring it out as we go.
Yeah.
So how did you solicit pictures and all the rest of that for your Instagram?
It was something that I think started happening 2 different ways. So once the article in Vogue hit, I guess you could say, and we went to 25,000 or so members of the community, people started sending us the photos that they felt were AWA. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Amanda wasn't originally on board, but then when she saw the excitement and got on board, she started doing her own digging into hashtags and different things around the internet.
That's when hashtags were huge. But then also the Accidentally Wes Anderson hashtag also blew up around the same time. So it was you could just search that and find a treasure trove of anywhere in the world that people were hashtagging it, or DMing them to us, and then we finally started the submissions through our website because we couldn't keep track of the DMs, the tags, the hashtags, and everything. So it was if people send them into our inbox, we can go through them a little easier and not lose them. So that's when it really started to become a little bit more organized.
And we were both working full-time jobs at the time, and this started as being, we'd work our 9 to 5, and then we'd come home and work for maybe 45 minutes in the beginning, and then it went to 2 hours, and then it was 3 hours, and then it was we liked to call it our full-time unpaid internship after hours. So that's where it started.
So Wes Anderson has a definite look with the way his...
For sure.
How do you go through and decide what goes into a book, in this book, in Adventures in particular?
Wes Anderson's aesthetic is very interesting, right? There are certain fundamentals that we have found that have kind of, come to the top. And if you look at his work, you'll see, bits of pastel, you'll see symmetry, you'll see sometimes asymmetry, you'll see stripes and patterns and things of that nature, sprinkling of nostalgia. So when you take that aesthetic and you turn it from the studio, where he has kind of built and storyboarded this process, and you take that and you turn that to a world that is very much imperfect and very much not perfectly aligned or symmetrical or pastel pink. What that does is it allows you to see the world kind of with a little bit of rose-colored glasses to a certain extent. It allows you to look kind of behind the facade and start to uncover these interesting stories that might be back there. And I feel like the community started to help us further understand not what Wes Anderson's aesthetic was, but what the AWA aesthetic was. And I think
so when you say AWA, you mean
Accidentally Wes Anderson. Okay. Less syllables, just but the same.
Easier.
Easier to say. But yeah, so the community has helped us kind of evolve that understanding of what is AWA to a certain extent.
So how do you choose the pictures, or are the pictures even adjusted afterward? Are people trying to make these pictures look like they came from Wes Anderson, or do you edit these photos so that they look more Wes Anderson-y once they go into the book?
Wes Anderson-y is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
We get, how many?
Around 2,000 to 3,000 submissions a month through our website.
Every single month.
Yeah, which is honestly my favorite part of this job, is to go through all the submissions, because you don't ever know what's going to be in there in the morning, and you can find some real treasures that you didn't know existed, or additional photos of a place that you have a great story on that it helps to have multiple photos of one location to help tell that story. So that's been a lot of fun. And once we have, I think, this like almost core group of photographers that send us stuff constantly. And it's really cool to see how you can tell by their photos that it's theirs by their editing and like the little sheen they put on it or just the way their style. And you're like, oh, well, I know that photographer before I even look at the name of who sent it. So they do most of the editing. We may tweak it so it fits in Instagram because you have certain, borders you have to make sure it fits in to like get the full photo. But when it comes to our photos that we take, our chief adventure photographer, Marjorie Becker, who has 60 photos in this book. She's been on every adventure with us since 2020. And we like to call it Marjorie Magic that she puts in her photos. It's just like a little bit of brightening, make it look like when you saw it, that's what it looked like. And sometimes when you take that photo, you're like, it looked so much better than that. And the camera just wasn't cooperating at the time. So we're like, can you put some Marjorie Magic into this and make it look like how we saw it? But we try to keep them as, you would see it in real life. So when someone does go to one of these locations, they're not like, wait a second, that's not this.
We want someone to show up at some of these places and see them and say, it's just as beautiful and interesting as I expected it to be when I saw it for the first time in the book or on the website or wherever they may have seen it.
Did you ask for approval from Wes Anderson before you published your first book, and this is your second book, or were you going to do it anyway?
Yeah, no, we were not going to do it anyway because so the idea of the book actually happened, something that we had thought about for a while because Instagram's very limiting in terms of the size that these beautiful photos could be seen at the time, and the size of the stories that you could tell are limited by a number of characters that you can post at one point in time. So we always thought it would be really an interesting project. And when we were on our first adventure, just Amanda and I traveled down to Buenos Aires, bought a couple cheap tickets and went down there about a year after starting the account. And that was the first time we ever shared any of the content that we were capturing on our own with this community. At the time, it was about 300,000 people or so over the course of a year and a half had rallied around this project. We don't ever like to use the word followers. It's easy to explain that, but they're members of the community. Community is always a proper noun in our book. But there were about 300,000 or so people, coming on this adventure with us. And so we touched down in Buenos Aires, capturing content, sharing it with them, and ultimately got an email out of the blue that said, accidentally Wes Anderson book, with a question mark. That was the subject. And in the body of that email, it said, if this is the Wally Koval I think it is, we went to high school together. And if it's not the Wally Koval I think it is, I'm still very interested in making a book project with you. Well, it turns out that it was a man named Michael Zerban, who I had gone to high school with. He had moved to New York City, started working for Hachette Little Brown, which is now our publisher. And ultimately, he was one of those first 1,500 members of the community that had rallied around this. But he said, I'd love to make a book project. We said, great. And he said, but you have Wes Anderson's approval, right? And we said, no, I've never spoken to the man before. So this was, again, a year and a half into a thing that had somebody else's name on it that we were not expecting to become well known. It was a thing that was for us, that was kind of our little pet project, so to speak. So now we had to go out in the world and find Wes. So we wrote emails, we wrote letters, we did literally everything short of sending a carrier pigeon. And we got in touch with lawyers, which is scary because we very much could have gotten a cease and desist. This is a well-known individual's name that we're just out in the world, in a gray area with. So luckily, after a long period of time, we did not receive a cease and desist, but rather we received a stamp of approval. And Wes said, you can go out into the world and make this book, but I will have final approval on that book.
Really?
Yeah.
So he has final sign-off on all of the pictures and the aesthetic and everything.
He had final sign-off on the first book. And I think that was him saying that in the beginning was, these are strangers on the internet who have created a thing.
I don't know what they're going to do.
I have no idea who these people are. And so when we sent him, we went out into the world and essentially made the first book on spec because we were working with
80 photographers from around 60 different countries for the first book. And
180 photographers from 60 countries. I just want to underline that because that is a ton of emails from, again, strangers on the internet and a bunch of trust from those members of the community to trust us, strangers, with their work to build a project out. So we did that for about
2 years.
About 2 years. We had a writing partner and a research partner, Domenica Aliotto. She was working around the clock, digging up interesting stories about these photos to help us kind of pull these stories together to make it more than just a picture book.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we sent Wes the final copy, and he could have said one of three things. One, he could have said, I don't remember giving you permission to do this. I have no idea what you're talking about. I am not interested in this project. He could have redlined the entire thing and said, this is not going out without my name on it. We would have missed deadlines. But instead, he had not many changes. He only had one change, and that change was a big one. It was the cover of the book. And he asked, basically, if we had other options for that cover. We had chosen a cover that was very much something we enjoyed, and we pushed back a little bit and very respectfully said, would you reconsider this? And he came back with one line in an email that said, what I like about what you do is that it's not so much like what I do. And with that, we
We're like,
said,
okay, we'll change the cover.
okay, we'll change the cover. And at the same time, we, I think, had a bit of an epiphany that this was something that was more than just us sharing photos and stories, but rather we had created our own side of things. We've created something that we're, I don't know, excited to explore in this community, and he's excited to see us explore it too. So I think that first portion of him saying, I need final sign-off, was him saying, all right, well, I'll let them go out and do this, but I got to make sure they're not, you know, they're going to do something that I can be proud of. So at the end of the day, he ended up writing the foreword for both of our books. So there's a stamp of approval from that perspective.
This is around the world. You've hit all the different continents, including Antarctica.
Yeah, that was crazy. And we wanted to make sure, I think, after we went on that trip specifically, that it had a bigger voice in this book because not many people get to go there. And in our first book, we had one location from Antarctica that was the Penguin Post Office. And ever since then, that had been like my dream. I was like, I'm going to Antarctica. I don't know what I have to do to make this happen, but we're going to Antarctica. So then when we were there, and Marjorie, our chief adventure photographer, came with us, and we just had so many amazing photos from there. We were like, well, we're not going to be able to just pick one for this book. So then it kind of morphed into these longer form adventures throughout the book in every chapter. The majority of them are from our travels, but there are still places that we haven't been. So we tapped the community to who had been to these places and had multiple beautiful photos of them that we could have use their photos for a longer form story in Egypt, in Uruguay, in New Zealand.
A few different other places.
Yeah, that we hadn't been yet, but we knew there were these amazing stories around these places and wanted to tell them. So it also brings you back to like the community with a capital C. Like this book wouldn't exist without them. We have not been to nearly as many places in this book. This book would have been, much smaller if it was just our travels.
Or we would have been traveling for a much longer period.
Yeah.
The first book was 180 photographers. This is 160. So and we're 38 different countries. So we're there's 200 places from all over the world touching every single continent. The book's broken up geographically, but then the difference between that first book and this book is that we have been able to tell some deeper, more interesting stories, bringing characters that we met along the way on many of these adventures into these kind of storylines, and really kind of getting to get a little bit deeper than we were able to in the first go-round.
I'm sure that there are at least one or two different stories that kind of stick out.
There's a few that, there's if you travel to Australia in the Oceania chapter, there's a town, Jinkumbilly Station, that has more platypuses than people, okay?
Really? Okay.
But then if we go a little north from where we are now up into Vermont, we were able to go up and check out this really interesting library/opera house that we were able to visit ourselves. This was built on across the border from Canada and the U.S. The border actually goes directly through it.
And there is a literal black line through the library that shows you which country.
So when that when that line was kind of laid years ago, this woman lived in that area, and she wanted to make sure that the community that had surrounded that area for a while would still have a place to gather. So she commissioned this library and opera house across the border, which is wild. People come from all over and can still enter. There is a literal black line down the middle with different insurance policies on either, and all of these things. And the fun fact that if you're a musician, you can tout that you're playing an international tour by playing just one date. So it's fun, it's factually based, it's interesting, it's historical, it's architecture, it's interesting people that have done interesting things that you maybe just didn't know about. I had no idea that place existed for a very long time.
Isn't there a restaurant on one side of the building, and then the library's on the other side, or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like the one U.S. library that technically has no books, and it's the one Canadian opera house that technically doesn't have a stage.
Oh, well, okay.
So it's a fun way of looking at it. But the stories, go on, and some of them we were able to tell from our own perspective, like our own trip to Antarctica or Vermont or Tokyo or Kyoto. But many of them are told by the community from their perspective as well. They helped us fill in the blanks. They helped us be introduced to people to help us tell these stories. So it was a really fun process.
So speaking of your perspective, are you both from Delaware?
Yep.
So are you trying to be, I guess, the third and fourth most famous people from Delaware next to Joe Biden and Aubrey Plaza? Is that what's going on?
We have zero aspirations of being any level of famous from anywhere. But, it's funny. When we put this out there, a lot of people don't know who we are, and that's kind of what we like. And if you'll look at the first or the second book, or if you look at Instagram on our socials and website, rarely do you see our faces. And that was a slight point of contention with our publisher, who wanted to put a headshot in the book on the jacket, and that wasn't something that we wanted to do. We kept sending them back of the headshots like this with our peace sign up, and it's a slight joke, but it's also, we're just part of the community too, and we're curating this for a large group of people, and we want to just be kind of in the audience watching this happen and help it evolve just as much as they say. So
Our dog gets recognized more than we do.
Dexter is in the book. He's on the back of the book. He's got a spread in the book. The man, the myth, the legend there.
Were you always interested in travel, or was this kind of come out of nowhere? Just an area of opportunity?
I think we were always interested in travel, and then once we went to Buenos Aires for the first time, it was like the travel bug just hit us so hard that we were like, where are we going next? How are we getting there? And taking as much PTO as we could because we both had full-time jobs. And I think we had just a lot of our friends were getting married at that point, and we were traveling for their weddings everywhere. So it was just became this okay, we're taking a weekend, and then we'll fly back in Monday morning, go directly to the office. Get as much time out of a place as you possibly can. So that was kind of the driving force behind this for sure.
Yeah, just kind of helping to figure out where we were going to go next.
Okay, so let me pick a continent and ask you to pick a picture or location out of each one. How about Asia? Talk about one of the pictures in East Asia, I guess, because you did break down, and Asia's enormous, so there are different places you could have broken down.
There's one place. One of the adventures that we went on was in Seoul. So there's a 7 or 8 page spread dedicated to our time in Seoul. 6 or 7 different locations, from palaces to libraries to venues in and of themselves. And one of the interesting reasons that we went over there was a lot of our photos ended up in an exhibition that started in Seoul in 2021 and has now kind of gone all over the place. So we went to visit our own exhibition there, which was a wild experience. And while we were there, we found so many unique takes on this. I don't know, Seoul as a whole was kind of this mix of super old and super new.
Super new, yeah.
And yet they lived in this interesting harmony where across the street from one of the oldest temples there is this brand new massive mall that inside of it has a library that you technically can't rent any books from, but you can spend time with. And the walls of this library go 2 stories high.
Beautiful.
Of books that you're pulling them off as you're going up the escalator by them. And so you have these interesting photos next to one another that look so different, but they're within walking distance. They're less than a block away, and they seem to have this interesting coexistence that wasn't something that was planned.
And what about sub-Saharan Africa?
The cable car, or the
Table Mountain.
Table Mountain.
In
that
South
story.
Africa?
Yes.
Table Mountain
Yeah.
is one of the most...
So much lore around that place.
So many, I mean, we go through 5 or 6 different people that scaled that mountain and shared their stories of how they did it, the different ways they did it, with what lack of equipment they used. So the stories behind it are just super interesting.
So the whole aesthetic of the book, there are very few people, but when they're there, they seem to be really small and far off and far away.
Sure.
Have you thought about expanding if you're going to do a third book? Would you expand it to include people, or are you going to keep it kind of this sort of aesthetic that you have right now?
I think with the way that our aesthetic has worked is, if you go back to what Wes said in that email of what I like about what you do is it's not so much like what I do. If you think of AWA as a dartboard, right? That bullseye would be a perfectly pink hotel, which was supposed to be the cover of our book, of the original book, Hotel Opera. It's a perfectly pink symmetrical hotel in the middle of Prague, and it's got a crazy story behind it. But it does look just like maybe something out of one of his films that has already been made, and so got it. So that would be the bullseye, so to speak. And then once you start to kind of explore those outer rungs is when you get into more people, and maybe things that Wes Anderson himself wouldn't necessarily touch on, but things that we're exploring because the community has shown interest in that. And that's where I think we've gone from just sharing interesting photos to the community actually teeing us up to say, I bet there's some interesting stories here. And so that was kind of the impetus for us exploring more stories behind it. They asked for the website, they asked for the newsletter, the book, all of these things. So the question of kind of that evolution of where it goes and what we might explore next comes from everybody sharing those photos with us, and Amanda and myself, mostly Amanda spending much of her time looking through every single one of those 2,000 to 3,000 photos that come in, every single one, every single month.
And see what the next evolution will be of the project.
It starts to evolve on its own from us looking at it, looking at the things that we're interested in, seeing what we've done, comparing this to the previous book and saying, I don't know, where are we going to go next?
And where do you think you're going to go? Because I thought it was interesting that there's an audio book with Jeff Goldblum doing some of the description of a book of photography. I did not expect an audio book coming out of this. Did you see that coming? And then if you didn't see an audio book coming, where do you think you're headed next with this project?
I think we definitely did not see an audiobook coming. We definitely didn't think that Jeff Goldblum would lend his voice to this project at all. But where do we see this going next? Again, it's up to the community. We have the exhibitions going on around the world. We have this as a second book. We had a puzzle and a jigsaw puzzle and a postcard book. I'm interested to see what we're going to do next too. So as being two of the people that are sitting in the audience of 2 million or so, I think we're just as interested to see where it's going to go next.
So where have you not traveled to yet that you want to travel to? Because you were bitten by the travel bug in Buenos Aires, and you've gone on and written a New York Times bestseller book, and you see all these other places. Where have you not gone yet where you would like to go?
We're still chasing our 7th continent, which is Africa. That's the only continent we haven't been to yet. I know. Now it's like, well, where do we start? And that we need to figure out. But that is my goal, is to get our 7th continent, and also to go see our new cover in Iceland soon, hopefully, fingers crossed. Because it was really cool when we finally got to go see Hotel Belvedere in Switzerland for the first book, and it was like almost like meeting a celebrity, but it was a building, and we just kind of like stared at it for hours, and we were like, this is so cool to like be holding the book and have it with the cover. Like, this is so cool. So I want to do the same thing there.
For sure.
So when are you going to do that? When are you going to go do your next
knock
step?
on wood, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
But I will say this. After this book tour that we're on, we're going to take a nap, and we're going to go to sleep for a little bit, and then we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we'll be able to go early next year to make it to see this lighthouse in person. That would be pretty amazing. But we'll see. We're not quite sure what's coming up next.
Let's get through the holidays.
Okay. All right. Well, Amanda and Wally Koval, thank you very much for your book. Thank you very much for giving me ideas. And thank you for making me go through and search for places that I might have been. And it's shockingly few, and I'm ready to go to some more so I can check out some of the pictures and locations that you described.
Love to hear it.
Yeah.
So glad. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Really
thank you very
appreciate
much.
it.